you so much for organizing this workshop and for having me. So I'm going to pick up on some of the topics that we saw in the first panel today. And as we heard, there's a lot of different debates about the social impact and the ethics of AI that have been going on for the last few years concerning kind of different aspects, concerning questions of fairness and discrimination and inequality, questions of privacy and data property rights, questions of value alignment between machines and humans or between different humans, all these concerns about the possible robot apocalypse, questions about explainability and accountability of algorithms and algorithmic decisions, questions of automation and the resulting inequality in the labor market. And so these debates can be fairly confusing, or at least they were quite confusing to me. And so corresponding to these debates, there are all kinds of efforts to potentially regulate AI, as we've heard. And what I'm going to try today, and also in this paper that I put on here, is to try and give a bit of a systematic framework from an economics perspective of how we can think about all these questions. And so kind of here are the key arguments I want to make and that I want to use to structure these discussions. First argument is if we look at what AI algorithms and machine learning algorithms more specifically do, at the end of the day, 95% of them boil down to some maximization of some measurable objective, a single objective. However, if we look at what's happening in society, and that's in some sense core to what economics is about, there are different people and different people want different things and have different resources. And it's even bigger issue in a very unequal society and a society where there's a lot of heterogeneity of values. And so if we want to think about any normative assessment about things on a society level, whether it's the impact of AI or the impact of regulations and so on, then we have to think about the winners and losers that are generated by technologies and by regulations, and we have to think about how we trade off these gains and losses and how to aggregate them in some way. And finally, if we want to think about how we create, broadly speaking, socially beneficial AI, we have to think about how do we align the objectives that the algorithms are maximizing with some notion of social welfare or society level well-being that's based on these trade-offs. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to elaborate on these points a little bit in some background. Much of this might be familiar. And then I'm going to use it to talk briefly about some of these debates on the ethics of AI. So to start with, my claim was that AI is primarily about maximizing measurable objectives. So here's a quote from one of the standard textbooks on AI, arguing that AI is about the construction of rational agents, and rational agents are designed to maximize some, again, measurable performance measure. And the leading approach in AI these days is machine learning, where machine learning essentially does this maximization based on data and statistical inference, broadly speaking. And it's true for all these different sub-branches of machine learning, right? Supervised learning being the biggest one, or most well-known one in some sense. But it's also true for fields like targeted treatment assignment, multi-armed bandits and their many versions, reinforcement learning, and so on. It's even true for language models and transformers and that type of approach. And so here, just to elaborate a bit on that, right? What are the objectives, right? Since that's what I really want to drive home in this talk is what are the objectives and how do we align them with what society wants. In supervised learning, it's typically some form of a prediction error loss, right? So you have a prediction G of X, some outcome Y, you're trying to predict some notion of loss of how far you're away from that. In targeted treatment assignment, which is actually the setting that a lot of the debates about kind of fairness and bias and so on touch on, it's about assigning some treatment to individuals typically, but the treatment is consequential for them. So think about getting a job, being in prison, getting credit, getting a medical treatment, things like that. That the treatment assignment is again done based on individual level features, and then we might evaluate the treatment assignment based on the realized outcomes for the treated. Similarly, in multi-armed bandits, where this is taking place over time, you're trying to learn which treatments are effective or things like that. You're trying to maximize a stream of, again, measurable outcomes Y. And again, in reinforcement learning, where the same thing happens dynamically, but past actions also affect future states. So kind of throughout the slides, I put in blue kind of the machine learning objectives. Now, if kind of switching gears, how do we think about social welfare? And this is kind of a nutshell summary of how economists, and I think also many political philosophers would think about, or people in the theory of justice would think about it. is that a lot of different normative notions of what social welfare is, and coming kind of from different political directions, if you want, argue that ultimately social welfare is about some notion of aggregating individual welfare, right? So formally you could think about there's a set of individuals in society. We have some notion of how we measure these individuals' welfare, that I denote VI here, and then we have some notion of how to aggregate it to a society level assessment. So F would be called the social welfare function in economics. Now, there's a ton of questions that type of framework opens up, right? And I'm not going to address them, but just to put them out there, right? The first question is who even counts, who's part of the individuals that we're thinking about? Right, this is just all the citizens of a country, all the residents. What about all humans on Earth? Do people in other countries not count? What about future generations? What about animals and so on? There's the questions of how do we measure individual welfare? Right, so big debate would be, do we care about opportunities or do we care about outcomes? Economists would often think about utility, so measuring welfare in terms of what you are revealed to prefer in terms of your own actions. John Rawls in the theory of justice would argue for resources or primary goods as kind of the measure of welfare, or Sen would argue for capabilities and so on. And lastly, there's the big question of how do we aggregate or trade off across different people. And again, that's what I want to emphasize here. We don't just have one objective, we have all these different objectives, VI, different notions of welfare, VI, and we have to somehow trade them off across people, right? So we have to ask how much do we care about millionaires versus homeless people, sick people versus healthy people. Does it matter that some groups were victims of historic injustices and so on in terms of how we assess welfare and trade off welfare? So lots of questions, but the big question again here is we have this notion of social welfare, F of V of the different V's, and that's in some sense normatively what we care about, and then we can ask how do we align that with what it is that the algorithms are maximizing in AI. And so that raises kind of the last background question I want to put up here, which is the question is who are the agents of change, right? Who has the capacity to align the objectives that the algorithm optimize with what we care about as a society or what we care about normatively. And so a lot of the discussions in the ethics of AI effectively boil down to some appeals to the ethics of corporate managers, corporate engineers, arguing there should be some self-restrictions, maybe we care about the curriculum or so to make them aware of ethics. In economics, we would typically think that private corporations are in the first instance, maybe not perfectly, but to a large extent, profit-maximizing entities, right? So if there is some conflict between what we care about normatively as a society and what's profit-maximizing, the latter is going to win out. And correspondingly, there are a lot of different potential actors in society that could be addressed by these debates about the ethics and social impact of AI, right? We don't have to focus just on corporations. There is consumer advocates, there is unions, there is courts and judges, there is policymakers in the public sector, there's social movements. There's many people we could address and could think of as potential agents of change here. And I guess the big point I would argue for is that ultimately to align what the algorithms are maximizing with what we should be maximizing as a society is to actually give effective democratic control to the people who are affected by algorithmic decisions over the objective functions that are being maximized. And so let me now take my remaining time here to talk about some of these debates on the ethics of AI and think about how this perspective or how this framework would allow us to rethink these debates. So one big discussion that we've heard about in the morning is about fairness and discrimination by algorithms. And so what I want to do here is kind of, I mean, this is maybe a bit of a caricature, but contrast some form of a standard view on fairness and bias relative to a view that I would advocate here based on the type of social welfare framework I put up, where typically when people talk about fairness or bias, there are many different notions that have been proposed, but I would argue that 90% of them boil down ultimately to the same thing, which is arguing that somehow we should treat people of the same merit, whatever merit means, similarly independent of group membership. And so really what that's formalizing is something that's been around in economics for a long time as a notion of absence of taste-based discrimination, which essentially says in the context of corporate decision-making, if you're profit maximizing, it's okay, and we only call it bias if you're deviating from profit maximization, if you somehow care, say, about group membership in addition to profits. But that's in a way a very, very limited notion of bias, right? And I mean, in some sense, it's baked into the notion of bias because it's just deviating from the objective, and it's baked into this single agent optimization framework of machine learning, that we think about it that way. But what that implies is, in some sense, that we only call deviations from profit maximization unfair, which is different from how we would think about impact of, say, an automated decision-making system on social welfare, including on inequality, right? If social welfare cares about inequality, which is about a counterfactual consequence of algorithmic decisions for the welfare of the people who are being affected, and maybe differentially for different people. And so often this welfare perspective will have different implications from a fairness perspective, because, for instance, if you think about what happens as we collect more data, prediction algorithms get better, and so on, generally that's going to lead to a more dispersed treatment assignment, right? The more information we have, the higher the variance of the prediction gets, so leading to more unequal treatments. And so typically that's going to be increasing inequality, and so therefore be bad for social welfare if you care about inequality. But it's also going to be good for fairness, because it's going to decrease the difference between predictions and the underlying merit that's being predicted. Or another set of context where there's a kind of a contrast between the two perspectives is if we think about any form of affirmative action or redistribution or compensation for pre-existing inequalities, that would be called biased or unfair by all these standard definitions of fairness that are floating around. So it would be bad for fairness and good for equality, and typically good for welfare. All right. Another debate that we heard about earlier is on privacy and data property rights and data governance, where, I mean, one well-developed framework in computer science is the framework of differential privacy, which I'm kind of simplifying a bit, but essentially it says that it should make no difference to you whether your data are included in a data set or not, right? And so there's no, in a probabilistic sense, there's almost no difference in the probability distribution of observed decisions or reports, whether or not your data are included in the data set. And one kind of remarkable feature of these definitions is actually that machine learning performance is essentially unaffected by imposing differential privacy, at least in large samples, right? So you can maintain this differential privacy, that it makes no difference whether your individual data are included or not, without affecting at all what's happening downstream in terms of automated decisions and any machine learning-based system. And so closely related to that is this notion of individual data property rights, which has been proposed as one remedy here, this idea that you should have a say of whether your data are collected and how they are processed and passed on. But in some sense, if differential privacy is maintained, then at least on an individual level, you have no economic incentive to care whether your data are included or not, because it's not going to not make a difference for you, while at the same time, all the downstream consequences remain, right? So expressing this in economic terms, we would say there's an externality of sharing your data. And actually what pretty much all of machine learning and AI is about learning these patterns, making these inferences, which are not about learning your individual data entry. It's about learning the relationship between different things in the data. And so privacy, in the sense of differential privacy, and individual level data property rights can do nothing to address any of these downstream consequences, whether positive or negative, right? Both for potential harms of automated decision-making systems, but also for the social benefits that come out of them. And so again, I would argue that we need some form of collective democratic governance of how data are collected and used, and individual level property rights will not be able to address these issues. And the last debate I want to briefly address here is these discussions about explainability and accountability of AI systems, where typically the question is asked about some kind of individual level recourse, kind of from a more legalistic perspective, right? Some automated decision-making system has made a decision, say, deciding whether I'm admitted to some university or I get a job or I get credit at a bank and so on. And then there's maybe I'm unhappy about the decision. Do I have any recourse? Can I ask the decision to be explained? And often that's framed in terms of saying that that the algorithm has to be simple in some sense, right? So whatever simple means, that's often a moving target depending on what your background is. Say if you have some statistics training, I don't know, like a linear prediction model might be simple. If you're not familiar with those, they might not be simple, and so on. And kind of related to this question of explanation, there's the question of who's responsible for algorithmic decisions. But this is again about individual level recourse. What I would argue is we should think about explainability not so much at this level of individual decisions or the question of why a decision was made, which in any case is not really a well-posed causal question, right? Because causal questions are typically about what if something changes, how would the decision change, not why did something happen. Instead, I would argue we need transparency and public debate about objectives and constraints and the space of actions that algorithms can play in. Right, so a lot of algorithms might be complicated, what's going on in the background, right? I mean, I don't know, take any type of deep learning model and the optimization algorithms that go into it and the hardware and so on, the data sets maybe. It's kind of hard to have a broad-based debate about those. But as we heard earlier, at the end of the day, these are reasonably simple systems in the sense there's a simple, well-defined measure that's being optimized, and we can have a public discussion about this optimization. Right? That's not hard to explain and debate. But who knows what's going into Facebook's algorithm for showing us its social media feed and ad clicks and ads and so on. But discussing about the fact that what they're doing is maximizing the probability that you're clicking on an ad, that is something you can do on a broad basis. And so if you think about explainability and accountability at the level of the system rather than the individual decisions, then I think this is again something that we can have a broad democratic debate about. And that debate has to be the starting point for democratic control of what's being optimized. So let me summarize my key takeaways. There's a lot of different issues that are being raised by AI and automated decision-making systems more generally, including questions of fairness, privacy, value alignment, accountability, automation, and others that I haven't listed. Resolving these issues, I would argue, requires democratic control of algorithm objectives and of the resources that go into maximizing these objectives, like data, computational infrastructure. And in order to get this democratic control, we need to have a public debate and binding collective decision-making at various levels in order to, again, align what algorithms are optimizing with what we care about as a society. Thank you.
And we have the first question, but we can have a second question. Perfect. There's another mic on the other side.
Yeah, Max, thanks for an excellent presentation. I loved your framing and taxonomy of all the issues from different perspectives. I think I get that, the algorithms have an objective that's aligned with profit maximization. That's very clear to me in the context of predictive AI, right? We've been thinking about recommendation algorithms, ranking, or social media in those contexts. I think my question is, when I put it in the context of these generative models, I'm not sure if the picture is that clear with a single objective, because these models have been developed, I guess, for auto-completion or whatever summarization, but they now do all kinds of things, and it's not very clear to me what's the objective function there in terms of how they're developed. It's certainly, I wish Simon was here still, so I don't know if taxing would help here, because they're developed for one thing, but they do all kinds of things that we do not understand. They give medical advice, they give all kinds of things that would fall into very different realms. So how do we think about generative AI within your taxonomy? It may be a hard question, but I just wanted to...
It is a hard question, and yes. I'm not sure I'm the best person to talk about it, but my understanding is, I guess, that in a way, like these systems are trained on like two steps at a basic level, right? The first one is basically a prediction, right? Like the self-supervised learning, where you kind of, essentially autocomplete, right? You predict like what would be the next word on the internet in this text, and then my understanding is that something like ChatGPT, then there's an additional reinforcement learning step where you had like human trainers who would evaluate the output in terms of, truthfulness or things like that. And that's essentially defining the reward that's then being maximized, which is some weighted combination at the end of the day between what would appear next on the internet and what would be evaluated as good by the human trainers of the model. how do we think about what the right objective there is? Again, I think it's an important debate, but I would stand by the fact that even these complicated systems, there is a numerical measure of performance that they are maximizing, and we can discuss what this numerical measure of performance should be.
Thanks so much. I mean, this was really a fascinating overview. Last week, a statistician from Berkeley was here giving a talk, Michael Jordan, and he was talking about how in AI, a lot of us think about this, you know, trying to create this mimicry, basically, something that's intelligent and something that's autonomous. So very much an individualized view of what AI should look like or how we should think about this. And he was pushing for this idea of the collective and thinking about this more in the context of collective rights and contribution in that sense, rather than this basic mimicry. And I wonder how this relates to the general argument you were making about moving away from kind of individual property rights to the more democratic governance aspect. And do you think there's a general view of moving towards this collective aspect?
I mean, so if I understand correctly what you're saying or what he was saying, I guess there's a bit of a demystifying going on, right? Intelligence is, what is intelligence? Who knows? Optimization is something we have a pretty good idea what it is, and that is kind of what's happening under the hood in pretty much all these systems. My understanding what Michael Jordan is interested in is, there's also a question of there's not just one of these systems out there, autonomous systems, there's many of them potentially interacting, which has its own questions, right? If they might not all be aligned themselves in what they're maximizing. And I think that again relates to the fact that there's, the same way there's not just one human out there. If there are many humans and they create many technical systems which interact in a way, the distributional conflicts that happen on the human level then kind of move forward into the conflicts potentially between these technical systems. I don't know if that answers.
Yeah, no, this is great. Thanks. A more systemic view of the whole thing.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.